This show is part of OnePlace, a daily network of focused briefings across the stories people follow most.
Welcome to our daily roundup. We have a packed episode today covering major legal updates, shocking cold case breakthroughs, and tragic developments in high-profile criminal investigations from across the country.
An Atlanta attorney's fatal shooting of his wife.
New DNA evidence links Ted Bundy to a teen.
Incriminating Google searches lead to a murder conviction.
A missing teen is found alive decades later.
A judge denies bond for a wealthy attorney.
Questions arise about a husband's grief and guilt.
A teen's murder appeal moves to high court.
A Florida vice mayor is found dead at home.
Let's start in Atlanta. The long-running legal saga of Atlanta attorney Tex McIver has reached a final conclusion. Back in 2016, Tex and his wife Diane were a prominent power couple in the city. While being driven home in their SUV by a friend, Tex, who was sitting in the back seat, fired a single shot from a .38 caliber revolver through the front passenger seat, striking Diane in the back. She later died during surgery. Tex claimed the shooting was a tragic accident, explaining that he had asked for his gun because he was nervous about the neighborhood they were driving through and then accidentally pulled the trigger after falling asleep. However, experts questioned if that specific revolver could simply go off without a deliberate pull. After years of trials and appeals, McIver eventually pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter.
The case took several dramatic turns before reaching this point. Initially, McIver was convicted of felony murder in 2018 and sentenced to life in prison. However, the Georgia Supreme Court overturned that conviction in 2022, ruling that the jury should have been allowed to consider the lesser charge of misdemeanor involuntary manslaughter. This opened the door for a new trial, but instead, McIver reached a plea deal in early 2024. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, but with credit for the time he had already served since his initial arrest, he was actually released from custody in January 2025. It brings an end to a case that captivated Atlanta for nearly a decade, leaving many still debating whether the shooting was truly a lapse in safety or something far more sinister.
Now to Utah. In a major breakthrough for a cold case nearly 50 years old, investigators in Utah have used modern DNA technology to officially link the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy to the 1974 murder of 17-year-old Laura Ann Imey. Laura disappeared on Halloween night in 1974 after leaving a party in Salem, Utah. Her body was discovered nearly a month later in American Fork Canyon. She had been beaten and strangled. While Bundy had actually confessed to killing Laura shortly before his execution in 1980, authorities at the time didn't have enough physical evidence to officially close the case or corroborate his claims. He was known for being vague about details, and without a forensic match, the Utah County Sheriff's Office kept the investigation open for decades, hoping that science would eventually catch up to the crime.
That scientific leap finally happened this year. The Utah County Sheriff's Office announced that they were able to extract a DNA profile from evidence found on Laura's body and match it directly to Bundy. Sheriff Mike Smith stated that they now have definitive proof, allowing the department to officially close the file. This discovery highlights the persistence of cold case investigators who refuse to let these stories fade away. For Laura's family, it provides a final, verified answer, even if the perpetrator has been dead for decades. It also serves as a reminder of Bundy's terrifying reach during the mid-70s, as he utilized various ruses to abduct and kill young women across multiple states. This closure brings a small measure of justice to a community that has wondered about this specific tragedy for half a century.
Next, a North Carolina case. A 26-year-old man in North Carolina, Zaki Davis, has been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the brutal murder of his girlfriend's 7-month-old son, Israel Williams. The incident occurred in December 2021 while Davis was babysitting the infant at his home in Charlotte. Throughout the evening, Davis had been texting photos of the baby to the mother to show everything was fine, but the situation turned deadly after he took the child upstairs. Within 30 minutes, the baby was unresponsive. What sealed Davis's fate during the trial was the digital evidence recovered from his phone. Investigators found that before calling 911, Davis had performed chilling Google searches for phrases like "baby acting lifeless" and "baby not responding but heart is." These searches proved he knew the child was in critical condition before seeking help.
The medical evidence was equally damning. as doctors determined the infant suffered from non-accidental trauma that could only have been inflicted by an adult. The Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office emphasized that the sentencing took place at the start of Child Abuse Prevention Month, serving as a somber reminder of the community's obligation to protect vulnerable children. During the trial, the prosecution used the cell phone data to create a timeline that showed a clear gap between the time the injuries were likely sustained and when Davis finally contacted emergency services. This delay, combined with the nature of his internet searches, convinced the jury that this was not an accident, but a deliberate act of violence. Davis will now spend the rest of his life behind bars, while the family of young Israel is left to mourn a life cut tragically short.
Moving to Arizona. In an incredible turn of events, a woman who vanished as a 13-year-old girl in 1994 has been found alive 32 years later. Christina Marie Plante, known as Tina, went missing from her home in Star Valley, Arizona, while walking to a nearby stable to see her horse. For over 3 decades, the case was cold, with no leads and no sign of the blonde, blue-eyed teenager. She had been entered into national missing children databases as endangered and missing under suspicious circumstances. However, the Gila County Sheriff's Office recently announced that thanks to advances in technology and modern investigative techniques, they were able to locate her. Now 44 years old, Plante has been reunited with the answers her community has sought for a generation. It is a rare piece of positive news in the world of cold case investigations.
While the discovery is a major success for law enforcement, the authorities are keeping many of the details private. They have not shared where she was found or the circumstances surrounding her disappearance 3 decades ago, citing a need to respect her privacy and well-being as she reintegrates into a life she left behind so long ago. The Gila County Sheriff's Office credited a detailed case review initiative for finding the new leads that eventually led to her recovery. This case serves as a powerful example of why police departments continue to review old files, as evolving forensic tools and database cross-referencing can sometimes solve even the most baffling disappearances. For the people of Star Valley, the mystery of the girl who vanished on her way to the stables has finally been solved, providing a sense of relief for the entire community.
Back to Tex McIver. Before his eventual plea deal, there was a critical moment in the Tex McIver case where his legal team fought for his release on bond. After the Georgia Supreme Court overturned his initial murder conviction, McIver's attorneys argued that he should be allowed to go home while awaiting his second trial. At 79 years old, his defense claimed he was no longer a flight risk and had already served significant time for a conviction that was no longer valid. They proposed a $220,000 bond and suggested he live with his sister in Texas. However, the prosecution fought this tooth and nail, arguing that because he had already heard a jury find him guilty once, he had every incentive to flee rather than face the possibility of returning to prison for the rest of his life.
The judge ultimately agreed with the prosecution and denied the bond request. Judge Robert McBurney noted that the previous guilty verdict was a powerful motivator for someone of McIver's age to avoid the courtroom. The hearing also featured testimony from witnesses who were close to the couple, many of whom urged the judge to keep McIver in custody. This moment highlighted the intense public and legal pressure surrounding the case. Even though the murder conviction had been overturned on a procedural issue regarding jury instructions, the underlying evidence and the gravity of the charges remained. This denial of bond kept McIver behind bars during the lead-up to his eventual plea of involuntary manslaughter, ensuring he remained in the system until the final resolution of the case was reached through his guilty plea and subsequent release.
Continuing with McIver, a central theme during the Tex McIver trial was the scrutiny of his behavior following his wife's death. Prosecutors argued that his actions were not those of a grieving husband, but of a man concerned with his own financial future and legal standing. During the 25-day trial, 70 witnesses were called, and remarkably, only one testified to seeing Tex show any outward signs of sorrow or grief. Instead, witnesses described a man who seemed preoccupied with Diane's estate and his own optics. This lack of visible mourning became a cornerstone of the state's argument that the shooting was intentional. While the defense argued that everyone grieves differently and that Tex was simply in shock, the jury was clearly influenced by the testimony regarding his cold demeanor in the days and weeks following the fatal incident in the SUV.
The prosecution specifically pointed to his actions immediately after the shooting as textbook example of what not to do. From his interactions at the hospital to his focus on legal strategy shortly after Diane passed away, The narrative of a cold-blooded killer began to take hold in the minds of the jurors. Even his friend Danny Joe Carter, who was driving the car when the shot was fired, provided testimony that painted a complicated picture of the couple's relationship and Tex's reaction. This focus on post-incident behavior is often used in high-profile cases to establish intent when physical evidence of a motive is thin. In Tex's case, the combination of a questionable accidental shooting story and a perceived lack of remorse created a hurdle that his defense team struggled to overcome throughout the lengthy and highly publicized trial process.
Now to Mississippi. The Mississippi Supreme Court has agreed to hear an appeal from Carly Gregg, a teenager who was convicted at age 14 for the murder of her mother and the attempted murder of her stepfather. Now 16, Gregg is challenging her conviction on several grounds, including claims that her constitutional rights were violated during the trial process. Her defense argues that she was forced to undergo psychiatric examinations by state experts before they had even formally announced an insanity defense, which they claim violated her Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights. They also contend that the trial was rushed at an unreasonable pace, with the judge refusing to grant continuances that would have allowed the defense more time to prepare for such a complex case involving mental health and the actions of a minor.
Another interesting point in the appeal involves the testimony of a state expert who discussed the novel Crime and Punishment. While on the stand, Gregg's attorneys argue that this narration had no clinical value and was used to unfairly prejudice the jury by drawing parallels between the defendant and the book's protagonist. The defense maintains that the trial court's rigid adherence to a strict schedule undermined due process and fundamental fairness. The state's highest court has scheduled oral arguments for May 27th, which will be a pivotal moment for Gregg's future. If the court finds that the procedural errors or the expert testimony were significant enough to impact the verdict, she could be granted a new trial. This case continues to draw national attention due to the age of the defendant and the shocking nature of the crimes.
Finally, in Florida, the community of Coral Springs, Florida is in shock following the arrest of Stephen Bowen for the murder of his wife, Vice Mayor Nancy Mateer Bowen. Nancy's body was discovered in the couple's home after she failed to show up for several important city meetings. Colleagues became concerned when she didn't answer texts or calls, leading to a welfare check by the police. When officers arrived, they found Nancy's body wrapped in blankets and garbage bags in a second-floor bedroom. Stephen Bowen now faces charges of premeditated murder and tampering with evidence. Investigators noted explosive-like damage to the exterior of the home, which they believe was caused by projectiles, suggesting a violent struggle took place. Stephen had allegedly told his parents he had a panic attack at work the day before the body was found.
The investigation moved quickly, as police used license plate readers to track Stephen's truck to a parking lot, where they began surveillance. The loss of Vice Mayor Mateer Bowen is a significant blow to the Coral Springs community, where she was a well-known and respected public official. Her colleagues described her as a dedicated leader, making her sudden and violent death even more difficult to process. As the legal case against Stephen Bowen moves forward, the focus remains on the tragic circumstances of a domestic dispute that ended in the loss of a prominent community figure. The details of the crime scene, particularly the attempt to conceal the body, suggest a calculated effort to hide the crime, which will likely be a major factor as prosecutors build their case for premeditated murder in the coming months.
That concludes our roundup for today. Thank you for joining us for these important updates. Be sure to follow this show for your next daily briefing on the stories that matter most.